Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for the Islam and Decoloniality. And as always, we try to bring you some of the most brilliant minds in both the Muslim and the non-Muslim world today. But today is a real special treat for us. Rarely will we get these opportunities throughout the year, although I do try my best. But I have someone that is incredibly special to myself personally, to many people in the world in terms of the influence he's had in making and pushing many young Muslims, intellectuals, ordinary communities, in pushing them to rethink how to reimagine Islam in the modern world. And that I'm uh, incredibly honored to have Professor Ebrahim Moosa from the University of Notre Dame, distinguished professor. And as those of you who have seen the flyer for this, certainly one of the, don't want to embarrass him too much, but certainly one of the leading, I think, Muslim thinkers in the world today. And so it is for us in Pakistan, our viewership in Pakistan, but this is, of course, a global YouTube channel. So we have a global viewership. It is an absolute delight and pleasure to have Professor Ibrahim Musa. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Ibrahim Musa, and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam, Dr. Junaid. Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be part of your show, and of course, I think fondly and care for you very fondly. But also, I remember your great father, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed.
Yes, yes, no. Professor Ibrahim Musa has a very long relationship with me and my late father, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmed, and so it's a very special evening for us tonight. I I also will say that Professor Ibrahim Musa, currently is in Notre Dame. He's the author of the best first book award at the American Academy of Religion. An excellent book that really transformed me in looking at pre-modern Islam in a certain way, just through the figure of the famous Ghazali, uh, Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. His editing of one of my father's ustads, Fazl Rahman's book, Revival and Reform in Islam and on Islamic fundamentalism. So his corpus of work and both in his books, co-edited books, his pieces, it's exceptional. And so I really do encourage beyond this interview to also see other incredible lectures by Professor Ibrahim Musa and to certainly check out his book. And the last thing I will say is that please, my viewership and Professor Musa, forgive me if I sometimes slip into the term of endearment of Ibrahim Bhai during this conversation because I'm just so used to it. So, please do forgive me for that. Uh, but so today's topic, and because we are always constrained for time, although sometimes I'm not, but certainly the producer will kick me off when I start to go above that time. This is the, I think, occupational hazard of us, some of us academics, that it's very difficult to stay within that time, but we will try our best, and inshallah, we can hopefully bring Professor Ibrahim Musa back for round two in going into some of the details of these things. But so tonight, I really wanted to go on the basics. I think that particularly for Muslim communities, but beyond Muslims and non-Muslims, the larger Islamic world, these issues we are constantly dealing with. They're nothing new, but we still don't seem. And I'm making a generalization here. Of course, there's a lot of people that are doing critical scholarship in here, but as a whole, there still seems to be some gaps here, and some reluctance to really critically engage. What does it mean when we speak about a concept known as of our Islamic tradition on the one hand, and then even getting into more dangerous territory, the idea of reform, and how perhaps reform may be distinguished from revival and so on. But these concepts that are so essential to us as Muslims and our identity and so on that we like to carry, um, it's still it's troubling that we do not have a sound grasp of kind of what we mean by it, and even more troubling and disturbing when we do believe we have a grasp of it, which may not be so accurate and that captures the full discursive tradition of that Muslim heritage. So these are basically the two themes I want to take up today, because otherwise Ibrahim Bhai and I can speak for hours on these things. I would love to just pick his brain all the time. So, but these are the two themes that I really wanted to
Good,
start out with,
good,
and I
good.
hope that's okay with you, Professor
Yes, yes,
Ibrahim
of
Moosa.
course, of course. Yes, of course.
Wonderful,
Well, as you
wonderful.
understand, that the question of tradition,
Yes,
and what is tradition, as well as the idea of revival and reform, are fairly well known concepts. I think one of the big issues that people in the modern world have found challenging is this question of tradition. What is the role of tradition? In other words, what had been handed down to us over the ages, and that which has been handed down constitutes authority. And when it constitutes authority, it then makes a claim on the way you conduct yourself, on the way you understand your values, your who you are and what you are. And in the modern world, Muslims have found that their tradition was disrupted by the onset of modernity through colonization. Now, obviously, in the past, Muslim societies from 7th century Arabia, when Islam moves into Iraq, Islam moves into Egypt, Islam moves into Persia, when Islam comes into contact with those societies, Islam meaning the teachings of Islam remain the same, but the interpretations become contextual. The context shapes those teachings. So God is one, the Prophet is the messenger of God, the Quran is God's revealed truth. But over time, in different contexts, people understand the subtle and broader implications of that in a very slightly different way from the way it was understood in 7th century Arabia. And that is precisely what the Prophet had said, that many of you who listen to my message will understand it better, or with more profundity, with greater insight than the one who had transmitted it. Many of you who listen to my message will understand it with greater profundity than the one who had transmitted it. In other words, built into the system of Islamic thought is the possibility that people will understand the same message in slightly different and different ways. That doesn't make it inauthentic,
yes,
but rather it is like a rope. Let's think of a rope, a very long rope.
right,
And I think of tradition as a rope. In other words, think of tradition as a rope that every generation weaves that part of that rope, right? So the 7th century Arabia people weave their ideas, their practices into the rope. The 8th century people in Iran or in Iraq or Egypt or sub-Saharan Africa or in China, they weave their part onto the rope. So this is a kind of a continuing rope. It's like a or let's call it a serial novel that people are writing. Everybody writes a different chapter to this novel, this rope. And everywhere in China, they use their indigenous materials to weave the rope. And in South Asia, they're using their materials to make the rope. and the colors and the textures of this rope are there. But what is a rope? A rope is this one continuous thing. But the key thing about a rope is that the various threads of the rope,
Mm.
they overlap. It's not the same thread that begins at the beginning, but rather pieces of pieces of the rope overlap and they hold it strong. And that's how a rope gains its strength, because of the overlaps. And when you overlap, there's something that is overlapped and something that you leave out. And that's how we need to understand tradition. And
Whereas,
so,
whereas, whereas often we make the mistake of just staying on the one side of the rope, that everything is in the Quran or the Hadith or the Sunnah, and we can find the verses that yes, those are the authoritative sources. But then the rope of the under unfolding of history of the Muslim
right,
endeavor.
precisely the unfolding of history. And this rope has within it the threads of the Quran, the Sunnah, the
Yes,
companions, the Imams, and all these authorities in it. It's weaved in it. But every generation weaves the rope in a slightly different way. The weave is different, and the weave is contextual. It's also the kind of materials that they have locally when they weave this rope, and the threads that they put in. So it's not as if you're reading out the substantial ingredients, but the way in which the rope is imagined. And history plays a very important role. What people do not understand, very few people understand it. They think that authenticity is to look like the original, but they don't understand authenticity is means responsibility. The 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 greatest definition of authenticity is how you are responsible, not how you are a carbon copy of the first instantiation. That is not authenticity. That is carbon copies.
right.
That is anachronism. That is making things look out of place. But author. So, for instance, there's a great hadith story that a person comes into the mosque of the Prophet. This person is seen to be a Bedouin, and the person says, "Ya Muhammad, mata sa'a?" Oh Muhammad, when is the hour? And the Prophet ﷺ was giving a sermon.
Yes.
Something is either someone is typing or I'm hearing some background noise. So the Prophet was giving a sermon, and in the sermon, he was being interrupted by this person who came. And after the Prophet finished his sermon, he said, "Where is the person who asked this question? Um, أين هذا يسأل عن الساعة?" Uh, and so he said, "It's me." So, he had the kind of Bedouin habit. He was very rough in the way he asked the question and so on, and said, so then he said, um, إذا ضيعت الأمانة فانتظروا الساعة. Um, so, so the Prophet said that when responsibility is destroyed, expect the hour. What is this man asking? This man is asking, when is the hour of judgment going to be? When is the world going to end? What's the kind of answer the Prophet gives him? When responsibility is destroyed. This is a smart Bedouin too. He said, فَكَيْفَ إِذَاعَتُهَا? How is responsibility destroyed? The Prophet gives this magnificent answer. إِذَا وُسِّدَ الْأَمْرُ إِلَى غَيْرِ أَهْلِهِ فَانْتَظِرُوا السَّاعَةَ. When responsibility, when matters are put into the hands of those who are incompetent, expect chaos and judgment day. In other words, matters will be what is judgment day? A day of chaos, a day of chaos and loss. And when you have irresponsible people in charge of affairs, you have chaos. And that's why the man asked about the big day of judgment. The Prophet told him that you're going to encounter judgment day on a daily basis when irresponsible people are put in charge of matters. In other words, the authenticity, to be an authentic Muslim, is to to be able to understand responsibility and understand your responsibility in a different context. You can't say, I'm going to pick up the pages of responsibility that was in 10th century Egypt or 11th century Iraq. No, you need to understand what is responsibility today, right? So when you're a person of tradition, you need to understand what is my responsibility today. I got an environmental crisis. I got global poverty. I got illiteracy. I got healthcare challenges. I need to our communities, and this is our communities are losing touch with the historical tradition, and therefore we need to gain a literacy. But gaining a literacy for our historical tradition doesn't mean that we need to parrot the tradition, but rather we need to understand the tradition. And when we
Right,
understand the
right.
tradition, that's where the idea of renewal and tajdeed, islah and tajdeed comes in. It seems that
And
you
just
want to
just
ask me a
before we get
question.
to that, Ibrahim bhai, just to wrap up the portion on the notion of tradition, there's of course a, a sentiment here that and that we've seen in the Salafi movement, whether of the more liberal orientation or of course the modern day, that of course a lot of this tradition, this historical baggage, dismiss and go back to the is I wanted you to specifically address, is there value, is there importance in that massive discursive tradition within Kalam, within law, within fiqh and Sufism and so on? Is is there any value in that at all? Because I hate to point this out to you. Of course, you will know it, but of course there are many Muslims that will believe that. Of course, that tradition is, we can just dispense with it and let's just try to deal with something new. Still, I mean, within the fold of Islam, but the point is that they were all pretty much useless. What
Yeah,
would your response be
yeah,
to that,
no, no,
particularly
yeah,
like a thesis that we
yeah.
know by a well-known person put, that someone like a wonderful the theologian, jurist, and so on, like Ghazali, being responsible for something that we often hear, the closing of the gates of ijtihad, the closing of the Muslim mind, and so on. So, what would you say
So,
to that person that says all of this kind of this tradition from the earliest times to the present is pretty much useless, and we don't
so this,
really have to engage it? What would you
so
say?
there's two questions that we can take several hours, but I will keep it brief. So, the first part is that, look, there is this sentiment that what we have been provided is the Quran, and we take the authentic hadith, and we can go and interpret and be free to interpret that. My answer to that is, as much as that is appealing, you're going to become a people without a history. You become a people without a history. But even to understand the Quran and the Sunnah, right, you need to have linguistic skills. You need to have the historical understanding of how was the word deen used in 7th century Arabia, and what were the multiple meanings of the word deen. The word deen means custom. The word deen means obedience. The word deen means um, calculation. The word deen means many, many different meanings of it. And you cannot access that by throwing away the historical tradition of how our forebears understood that. So, history and the historical understanding of our tradition, and strengthening our historical tradition, strengthening the understanding of history in all the disciplines and so on, are absolutely vital. You can't do a presentist reading of the Quran and say, I'm just going to ignore everything that everybody else. I got the Quran in front of me, and I got the English translation, and I'm getting it. But that English translation, already a translation, it has all the flaws and the weaknesses of the translator's lack of skill, or brilliance of the translator. It can go either way, and the translator will present it to you. So no, I think we need the historical tradition in order to make sure that how the message was understood then. Now, as I said, that messages get understood differently at different times, but you do these adaptations within a particular paradigm and framework, and you need to have the light of history shining on you. Otherwise, we become what the great historian E.P. Thompson says, this enormous condescension of posterity, that we who are posterity, we in a very condescending way saying, oh my God, these people understood it so terribly in the past. And we become like the Quranic verse that says, when people are thrown into hellfire, as the Quran says, then every group that comes into hellfire, they curse and say, that the previous group that came here, they told us to do these wrong things, therefore we are here. Kullama dakhalat ummatun la'anat ukhtaha, the Quran says. So in other words, we're always cursing the preceding generation for misleading us. That is not the virtue, and that is not the characteristic of the people who are going to paradise. The people who go to hellfire keep on cursing their predecessors. The people who are going to paradise bless their predecessors and say, you have brought us a torch, and we gratefully and respectfully carry this torch, but we might put on some different cover over this torch. We will give it a different way that we will project this light. But thank you for the torch, and thank you for we are grateful for that. But we are not going to say that they were all bad and they were terrible people, and we understand it better than them. No, what we need to learn in the question of tradition is that we are different. We are different, but we do not negate their contribution. Therefore, one of the biggest challenges for us, Dr. Junaid, today is that we need to make the treasures of Islamic thought available to Muslims, but we need to make it available to them in an intelligent way, that they understand what the jewels are, and that they don't understand it as mumbo jumbo, but they understand that these are useful ways of understanding it. People keep on complaining and saying, the West, has made progress and so on. I don't fully understand what they mean. But one thing I can say, at every small and big college in North America or Europe, you will have someone teaching the classics, either the Greek classics or the Roman classics. Okay. And these people will be writing books that, few people will read, but they will look at one issue of, for instance, how did people do carpentry in the Greek world? How did people do certain other things in the Roman world? And that's how you begin to understand what history is and what situation is. And in the Muslim world, the attention to history, the attention to our classics, the attention to these various important things in our tradition are only available, and these skills are only available in the madrasas. And myself, being a graduate of the madrasas, understand the value of the madrasas. But what we need is to make these madrasas dynamic, and that the jewels of those madrasas can also become accessible to millions and millions of people, so they can understand and engage with their tradition and learn from their tradition, but also make their contribution to the rope of tradition. Do I still have you, Junaid Bhai?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that's brilliantly. That's exactly what I was looking for, in response to precisely the type of approach, that unfortunate approach that many Muslim moderns do take to this
Now you ask me. You are the two other. There are two other questions. One is, or three questions. One is that this very idea, the Muslim tradition has built into it the idea that there will be islah, to make things better. Islah, okay.
Yes,
The Quran talks about muslihun,
and
the people.
to make that the distinction between Islam and the Tajdeed, and why we
Tajdeed.
should not be afraid of it. Of
Exactly,
the form.
exactly.
Yeah.
So so the Prophet alayhi salam had said that God will send over at the beginning of every 100 years a person, or some people think in groups of people, who will yujaddid, will renew the faith. Okay. And they will do the islah. They'll be the muslihun. So what is this tajdeed means? In other words, this tajdeed will bring into into visibility the Sunnah. And what is the Sunnah? The Sunnah is the historical practice. In other words, bring into visibility. It doesn't mean it's going to replicate the Sunnah, but it's going to make you aware of your historical past, the way in which your messenger, your prophets' teachings became capacious over time and had different kinds of applications. In other words, it's trying to tell you, have courage, move forward, but always keep one eye in the rear view mirror where you've come from. Okay. But it doesn't say you need to fully, and this is the kind of difficulty we have, that some people, well-meaning people, people that I love and I respect, who are basically saying that you need to go back to the text and give no context to the text and don't understand how this text had been understood and interpreted, because otherwise, because they disagree with all those millions and millions and billions of Muslims that passed before, that they didn't understand it properly, possibly. And that is the weakness. That is the weakness of that approach. What we need to say, that different people understood it differently. They were also different, but we do not negate their experience, and we build on their experience, and we take ownership of our own experience, and we put our experience in conversation with the Sunnah. We put it into conversation with the text of the Quran. And in order to be sure and to be confident in what we are doing, we keep the Sunnah and the historical tradition always under our right arm, and we move forward with it with confidence. And that is precisely what renewal and reform means. Reform and renewal doesn't necessarily mean that we have to accept the dominant fads and the dominant trends that are available, but also some of these dominant trends and so on are also, become now our trends, and they become part of our lived reality. What we need to see is that how does a lived reality, whether it's economic system, a political system, a cultural system that are now become global, it's part of everybody's experience, how does this work best for us? Okay. And the problem is that you cannot turn the clock back. This is absolutely something that most people think authenticity means turning the clock back. No, authenticity means understanding that a broken clock can be correct twice in a day, but that you don't have to read that time. That what you need to understand the arc of history, and you need to understand your responsibility and your role in the making of that. Your second question was, this is about Imam Ghazali and his role. This is a absolute calumny and an insult to a great scholar, that many people are saying that Ghazali brought about the end of philosophical thinking. To the contrary, Ghazali, and I might disagree with Imam Ghazali, that he had possibly critiqued too harshly the Muslim philosophers on three issues, but on those other issues, he's fully familiar and rather borrows rather freely from the Muslim philosophers. And in fact, many people can't digest Ghazali because they think that Ghazali took too much philosophical baggage on board in his own thinking. And for instance, a book like The Niche of Lights, Mishkatul Anwar, has strong borrowings from Ibn Sina. The same Ibn Sina with whom he disagreed with Ibn Sina, told Ibn Sina that you believe in the eternity of the world. You don't believe that God, or the way you expressed yourself, that God only knows the universals, not the particular. I don't agree with you on that. And about bodily resurrection, the philosophers had a different view, that it would not be bodily, but it's the spiritual resurrection. I think Imam Ghazali went a little bit too strong on that by anathematizing the Muslim philosophers on that and say takfir. But when he was pushed, and he asked himself the same question on the last page of the book, called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, when he's asked, so are you saying that these people are all wrong, and therefore they had committed blasphemy, or not blasphemy, but rather they stepped outside the fold of Islam, and that they should be executed? So he said, no, I that is not the question for now. He basically tried to then massage his position and say something like, He said something like, "It is some people might think of this as bid'ah, as a kind of a different view that is contrary to the historical tradition." Because what he was saying is that on these three issues, some of the Muslim philosophers, especially Ibn Sina, is out of sync with the historical tradition. What he might have, but Ibn Rushd answered Ghazali on that and told him that, listen, you set up your own standards for when you can expel somebody from the framework of Islam. And unfortunately, he told Imam Ghazali that 100 years later, that you have violated your own principles of interpretation. And that is that you can only expel somebody when there are no possibilities of interpretation, when it's a categorical truth. And all these three matters, these things are open to and they are susceptible to multiple interpretation. Why have you gone so harsh? Why have you gone so harsh? And here I must say that Ibn Rushd makes a lot of sense. But this idea to think that one person can blow down the whole, Islamic tradition, it is the most ludicrous thing that I've ever heard. And I
Right.
don't know why intelligent Muslims don't tell those advocates who's blaming Ghazali, and to say, listen, have you ever studied history? Do you know how history works? It's not one person cannot destroy the entire intellectual tradition. This intellectual tradition, the people who are saying that don't know what the intellectual tradition is. They don't know how complex it is. They have no knowledge about it. They take one slice and one page out of that and want to judge the entire tradition, and what I call scapegoat historiography. See, part of this problem is not only some thinkers in Pakistan, but also some thinkers in the Middle East and elsewhere, that when Muslims wake up from the dark night of colonialism, they then realize, oh my gosh, why have we lost out so badly? Why have we become, at the bottom of the heap of the world's civilizations? And now they do this very simplistic diagnosis. And the simplistic diagnosis is, well, Europeans have philosophy, they have science, they have logic. We had it, and we had philosophy, and we had science, we had Ibn al-Haytham, and all this kind of people. What happened to us? Well, somewhere along the line, someone said we mustn't study philosophy. Someone along the line, we ignored scientific and empirical studies. And so someone had to be blamed. And said, oh, yes, see, Ghazali blamed that. As you would know, many traditionalists who followed Ghazali advocated philosophy, and philosophy continued for a long time after Ghazali to be a very, very robust tradition from people like Fakhruddin al-Razi, Mullah Sadra later on, and in between, you know, millions and millions of scholars who studied philosophy and brought it into conversation. What has happened in contemporary times, Muslim religious thinkers are not open to modern knowledge, in mixing that modern knowledge and understanding of the deen, and are also not using sophisticated ways of understanding both the historical tradition and what the meaning of Islam is today. And unfortunately, we are confronted with people who just do very simplistic readings of the Quran and very simplistic readings of the Hadith, including very intelligent people who do that and don't know how to present the gems of Islam within a contemporary context. And when you have when you have confidence about your tradition and you have confidence about your role in history, then you can obviously provide for interpretations that are going to look different from those of the past, but they're also going to have continuities. And that is the beauty of Islam as a tradition, where when you have both revival and reform, Islah and Tajdeed, as part of your toolkit to move into a different time space and a geographical space.
I'm very glad, Ibrahim Bhai, that you mentioned that, you know, even the thesis that Ghazali is responsible for all of this, the sheer ignorance of the amount of incredible philosophical thinking taking place in South Asia and other places well after Ghazali totally erased complete ignorance of what's going on in the. So
Totally.
I mean, the thesis is so erroneous, and the tragedy is that it keeps on becoming getting regurgitated by people that know nothing
and
about it.
repeated and repeated and I would be happy to also strongly contest that. The other scapegoat that people made was that Ghazali, and the other thing was Sufism. So Sufism, Islamic spirituality, and especially Islamic spirituality when it gets to the popular level, when people visit shrines and they go for pilgrimages and they are asking for certain kinds of amulets to be written, um, the cult of the saint and the cult of charismatic figures and so on and so forth. And so people say, you see, aha, this bad Sufism. And who legitimated bad Sufism? Ghazali. Ghazali legitimated Sufism and put Iranian ideas into the womb of Islam. And see, that's where Sufism led to. And so the masses became ignorant, and therefore the masses then followed charismatic leaders, and we lost our mind. That's not true. That's not true. First of all, the idea of literacy being 100% in all communities before 300 years prior was not even an ideal. That was never an ideal, neither in Europe, nor in Africa, nor in Asia, that everybody can read and write. This is the gift of the modern world, that lay people become literate. People were literate in oral cultures. They could speak a language, they could hear a language, and so on, but that people could read and write. And also, in all civilizations, there were elites who could read and write, and they would then interpret for people who could not read and write, and people who could not consult. What do you think that 500 years ago, you think people had copies of the Quran in South Asia that they could read? No. There were very few Qurans available in writing, and maybe most of the things that people memorize, they memorized the Quran, and then they would sit with someone who memorized the Quran, and they would listen to the Quran in a household or in gatherings and so on and so forth. Or there would be small pieces of the Quran being written on elementary forms of writing that people could have. This idea of that we have a Quran I've got dozens of Quran in my house in different colors and forms and shapes and so on. That is thanks to a certain kind of technology and thanks to Gutenberg that we have now a printing press that creates that. So always in the past, literacy was not something that was widespread. There were what happened, what how Muslim societies benefited, that they had a fairly elite class of learned people, and they had madrasas, and these learned people could then run the bureaucracies, produce knowledge, and then this knowledge will be interpreted in oral cultures to people below, and people's understanding at different levels of revering a saint, understanding the meaning of having celebrations of celebrating the prophet's birthday, celebrating important events and so on, for a long time considered to be forms of piety and practice, of people both learned, both elites, and what we would call the multitudes, and the masses. They would all participate in this kind of conversation. So I don't understand this idea that this is the poverty of history, of Muslims not understanding their history, the poverty of history, and that poverty of history also results in a poverty of dignity. Not understanding your history means that you have a deficit of dignity in the present, and you're watching everybody else progressing, and you looking at other cultures and civilizations with great envy. And then what you then do is that you just like pick up one or two ideas from your own tradition, and now you're saying, I'm just going to run with that. You pick up two verses, or you pick up a certain kind of paraphernalia of modes of dress, and so on and so forth, and say, hi, I'm authentic. And that is not authenticity. That is possibly the opposite of it.
No, no, absolutely. The discourse on the historical tradition, as you've said, the poverty, the impoverishment of that is the major roadblock that we have to overcome. I absolutely agree with you. Just in about 3 to 4 minutes, I cannot um, hesitate to not ask you these two things. Once again, coming to the issue of why the term reform for Muslims, whenever you speak about that, why does it seem so threatening and so why are they so afraid of that when we can take a simple, very simple example, as I'm sure you and others point out? Look, slavery in pre-modern times, it was normal. It was. Do we have it now? Did it require much? But no, we have overcome. That is a reform that we have undertaken. So I wanted you to speak to that. Why are we so afraid of that term? And the second, very very quickly, is also we on the one hand we do focus on the correct justifiable culpability of the way under the past 300 years, the type of Islamic revival that has kind of impoverished the discourse around our discursive tradition, and in a very reactionary way, but also the culpability of the elites of the elites of many Muslim lands that have not taken that tradition seriously, and that as you often say, what is the goal for them today? Send their children to be engineers, and maybe doctors as well. So they're also culpability in preventing the space for
Hmm.
genuine Muslim literacy
Yes, yes,
to
yes.
emerge, both within the madrasa and outside of the madrasa as well. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
those 2 points.
Yes. So I mean, you see, there's a lot of anxiety about reform. The anxiety, and also then when you have anxiety, then you buy any story, and then you buy into conspiracy. Okay, so you become conspiratorial. So the people will say, why must we change in Pakistan? Why must we change in Egypt? Okay, why is change required? Why is change necessary? Well, your economy now is a different economy. You have new energy sources. You're no longer on a bullock cart. You're on trains. You are on planes. You now understand how your body works in a different way. You don't believe in the four humors, but you now believe in pathogens. And now it is bacteria that make you sick, and you need vaccines. And it's a whole new scientific. So it's a whole new cosmology has come back. And the world above you, that you first thought that these are levels of depth of skies and so on and so forth. No, it's an unending cosmos, and we can go now and reach other planetary systems. So a whole new cosmology has come about, and therefore for you to remain relevant and for you to make intelligent sense of your tradition, you need to come to terms in interpreting your tradition now, and how it's going to relate to these realities. And there might be some things that the historical tradition understood it in one way, but you're going to understand it different. So the whole idea of reform is to develop coherence, and that you sound intelligible, and you don't make your tradition an obstacle to your own human flourishing and your own human development. Because at the end of the day, the Prophet ﷺ and Allah in the Quran wants us to flourish as human beings, to realize our dignity, and to make other people's dignified, and to make other people's world and lives better, and to create a world of peace and tranquility, of cooperation and diversity, and human equality. Unfortunately, you're going to find in Pakistan many people who still believe that if you're going to have a legitimate jihad, then the prisoners of war that you take, you can enslave them. Unfortunately, there are scholars who still believe that. That's exactly, and that's the embarrassing part. And many of your listeners might be embarrassed that there are such people. I'm not going to call them out right now, but I read their works and they say these things, and not only in Pakistan, but elsewhere. And that is because people have just not paid attention to history and tradition, and how a tradition unfolds in time. And this precisely, um, and you see, some of those people who believe in the text and what's the name, they just shunt this thing, they just shunt it out, though they have a very thin interpretation of how they interpret away slavery. But according to their own criteria, they should be sticking to slavery, right? But you see, when it suits them, they return to history and say, no, Islam never meant that slavery should be eternally part of human society. It was only a temporary possibility. But the arc of Islamic history, the arc of Islamic morals and values was always there towards to reaching greater equality. And so that means greater equality between men and women. That means greater equality between believers and non-believers, right? Also, and that you have to treat your Hindu and Christian and other neighbors as your equals, and that you should be able to make them partners in governance, right? And without giving them a second class position and so on and so forth. These are total realities. Or that you cannot continue with class based practices or with caste based practices in Muslim societies. That is the line that we need to do. And there's lots of caste in South Asia between Muslims and among non-Muslims and so on. And these are the issues that we are not prepared to address. And you said something very beautiful, and that is and
Ibrahim,
that is
Ibrahim,
the
please,
couple.
yeah.
My last word: the culpabilities of the elites. Absolutely, our elites are so culpable. They like to hear, and they would say to me, "Yes, Ibrahim Musa, you're saying very good things. I'm with you." The moment I ask them, can you give me a donation for someone to give a scholarship to someone who's studying at your college in Pakistan or in any other college in Pakistan who's going to do some in-depth study of Islamic studies on a particular understanding of history, he's going to tell me, "Oh my God, I've just exhausted my donations this year, or I've been hit very hard with taxes this year." But when someone comes to that person or him or her and says, "Listen, I just need some money to put in the janamas in this masjid and so on," he's going to cut the check straight away. Because when he sees the janamas, he is cha-ching. He's getting sawab. The Muslim elite do not understand the thawab in knowledge. They don't understand the virtues in knowledge. They don't understand what are the gifts that they're going to create. These are the invisible gifts. And they don't understand that when you invest in knowledge, you're going to get blessings as long as this knowledge exists in this world. That janamas is going to be worn out after 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years. And then you're not going to get sawab anymore, because they're going to throw out their janamas. They're going to throw out that carpet from the mosque, and they're going to put someone else's carpet in. But knowledge that you invest in, and you make Pakistan or India or any Muslim society a knowledge-based society, a society rich in its tradition, rich in its understanding of what the present is. I want you to talk to me after 10 or 15 years, and you see the advances that your culture and society will make. Those are the possibilities that are available. But unfortunately, the gifts in your society, the gifts in our societies among Muslims, have not been fully harnessed and have not been fully put to work. And I believe that we will get opportunity to talk more about that. I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you for inviting me to
Absolutely.
participate here today.
No, no, no. Jazakallah. And inshallah, I will hope to somehow cajole you to a part two session of this because it's just fascinating discussion. Uh, Ibrahim Bhai, Professor Ibrahim Musa, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the program with us today.
Thank
Jazakallah
you so
khair.
much, Dr. Junaid.
All right.
Thank you.
Walaikum Ibrahim Bhai.
Allah bless you. Masalama.